You know the sound of a TVR, even if you've never seen one, that bellowing, physical roar that made Jeremy Clarkson grip the wheel with a look of pure delight and terror. The noise of a car that trusted you completely and forgave you nothing. For a golden decade, TVR was Britain's last great independent. The Griffith, the Cerbera, the Cerbera, the Sagaris, hand-built in Blackpool by nearly 1,000 people, 40 cars a week leaving the gates. They built their own engines when Germany threatened to cut off the supply. They outsold Porsche and Ferrari on a car that didn't exist yet. They shrugged off every rule the modern world tried to fit them with, and the faithful loved them for it. And then, after 60 years of building the most exhilarating cars in Britain, the factory fell silent for good. How does the last great British sports car maker, adored, defiant, entirely its own, simply disappear? What happened inside those gates? Chapter 1. Blackpool Thunder. Blackpool, after the war, was a town that mended its own machines. The trams that ran along the front, the rides that turned on the pleasure beach, the lorries the army no longer wanted. Somebody in Blackpool would strip them down, weld them back together, and send them out to earn their keep for another decade. It was a town of grease under the fingernails and improvisation as a way of life. And in a rented workshop in Beverley Grove, an old wheelwright's premises that still smelled of sawdust and linseed, a young man named Trevor Wilkinson was one of those somebodies. Wilkinson had been born in the town on the 14th of May 1923. He'd left school at 14 and apprenticed himself to a local garage, and by his early 20s he'd caught the affliction that runs through every real engineer. The stubborn conviction that he could build something better than the thing in front of him. In 1946, he took on that little workshop and called the business Trevcar Motors. He reconditioned vehicles, he fixed fairground machinery and mended the ex-army trucks that were flooding the country now that the fighting was done. It was honest, unglamorous work, and it paid the bills while he turned over in his mind the thing he actually wanted to do, which was to build a motorcar of his own. The first one arrived around 1949, a tubular steel chassis of his own design, a modest Ford side-valve engine, and, according to at least one account that has followed the company ever since, running gear that had begun life under a fairground dodgem. It was crude, and it was light, and it was quick, and it carried a name that was really just Wilkinson's own, with the vowels knocked out of the middle. Trevor became TVR. His partner Jack Pickard helped keep the lights burning through the lean stretches. And in 1953 came the decision that would shape everything the company did for the next half-century. They began building their bodies out of glass-reinforced plastic. Fiberglass. It was a new material then, exotic and slightly disreputable, and it suited a small firm perfectly. Light, strong, cheap to mould in the tiny numbers TVR dealt in, and impossible to dent the way a steel panel dents. You didn't need a press the size of a house. You needed a mould, a bucket of resin, and a pair of skilled hands. The first true production TVR, the Grand Tourer, followed in 1958, and with it, the template was set. A light chassis, a borrowed engine, a hand-laid fiberglass shell, and just enough power to frighten the driver. For years that was TVR, a tiny Blackpool concern building, fast, light, fiberglass cars, for people who already knew what they were buying and didn't need to be sold. It was never going to trouble the giants at Dagenham or Longbridge. It didn't want to. In 1965, a young enthusiast named Martin Lilly took the company on and steadied its permanently wobbling finances. He gave it the Timar, the first TVR you could actually load through a hatchback at the back. He commissioned the sharp, wedge-shaped Tasman, styled in 1980 by Oliver Winterbottom, a designer who had sharpened his pencil at both Jaguar and Lotus before he came to Lancashire. And through all of it, Lilly fought the specific enemies that pick off small car makers one by one. A fire tore through the factory in the 1970s and gutted the place. The oil crisis throttled demand for anything that drank fuel. Suppliers went on strike. And across the Atlantic, American emissions law kept tightening until it quietly shut TVR out of the one export market big enough to make the sums work. The costs climbed. The wedge-shaped Tasman was received without much warmth. By 1981, the money had simply run out, and Lilly did the thing that founders and rescuers eventually do. He sold control to one of his own customers, a chemical engineer from Sheffield who already owned a Timar turbo and happened to have a great deal of North Sea oil money in the bank. That customer would spend the next 23 years turning this fragile little firm into the most gloriously, defiantly, dangerously British car company of its age. And the reputation those cars would earn, that they were built somehow to kill the very people who drove them, is the reason you're here. But the truth is stranger than the poster promises, and a good deal sadder. Chapter 2. The Oil Man. Peter Robert Wheeler was born on the 29th of February, 1944, a leap year child, which somehow suited a man who never seemed to do anything on the ordinary calendar. He grew up in Sheffield, took his schooling at Bishop Vesey's Grammar School and then his degree at the University of Birmingham, and came out the other side a chemical engineer. In 1972, with £200 and a great deal of nerve, he started a company making specialist equipment for an industry that barely existed yet, the oil and gas rigs then going up in the grey water of the North Sea. The timing could not have been better. Britain struck oil, and the men who supplied the men who drilled for it did very well indeed. Wheeler, who loved fast cars the way other men love their children, found himself with money and went looking for something worth spending it on. He was already a TVR man. He'd bought himself a Timar Turbo and fallen hard for the thing. The noise of it, the lightness, the sense that the car was a co-conspirator rather than an appliance. So, when Lilly's firm faltered, Wheeler didn't merely buy another car. He bought the company that made them. You have to picture the man to understand the company because for 23 years they were the same thing. He stood 6'6", and getting him out of one of his own low-slung sports cars was like watching a deck chair come apart in stages. There was almost always a cigarette going. A Marlboro, always a Marlboro, burning down somewhere near his enormous hand. He didn't just own racing cars, he raced them, competing in the one-make Tuscan Challenge and campaigning a lightweight Aston Martin DB4. And he nursed one great animating dislike, which he shared with anyone who'd stand still long enough. The Porsche 911, a car he regarded as a personal affront to be mocked at every possible opportunity. Harry Metcalfe of Autocar once drove the length of the country with him, Blackpool to Scotland in a Cerbera, and the picture he brought back is the truest portrait we have. Wheeler at the wheel of his own creation, puffing away on the Marlboros, talking about old girlfriends and, above all, returning again and again to his favourite subject in the whole world. How perfectly dreadful the Porsche 911 was. That was the man. Funny, opinionated, unfiltered, and completely gloriously sure of himself. And here is the thing that ought to have been impossible. Wheeler had no background in the motor industry whatsoever. He was a chemist who'd got rich off oil rigs. Yet he designed cars, not with computers or customer clinics or focus groups, but by eye and by instinct, standing in the styling studio with his own hands on the clay. His dog came to work with him and had the run of the place, a pointer named Ned, who wandered the studio as though he owned it. And the single most told story in all of TVR folklore is the one about the day Ned went charging about as usual and took a bite clean out of the foam styling model of a new car they were shaping, a car that would be called the Chimera. Wheeler looked at the recess the dog's teeth had left in the nose of the model. He liked it, and he kept it, turning the mark of a dog's bite into the housing for the front indicator on a car that would sell in its thousands. That is, quite literally, how TVRs were designed, by a chemical engineer, and now and then by his dog. His first major move as owner was the heart of the thing. He hauled TVR away from the aging Ford Cologne V6 and dropped in the aluminium Rover V8, the old Buick-derived lump that had already served under everything from the Range Rover to the police patrol saloon. It was light, it was torquey, and it made a magnificent noise. In the Tasman 350i of 1983, with around 197 brake horsepower in a car that weighed almost nothing, TVR suddenly had the recipe it would ride for the next decade. A light body, a big engine, an enormous noise, and not an ounce of fat anywhere. That was the founding belief, and Wheeler held it like scripture. Lightness beats cleverness. A curve beats a computer. And a driver who can hear and feel every single thing the car is doing beneath him is a safer driver than one wrapped in electronics he has slowly, fatally learned to trust. Ben Samuelson, who worked alongside him for years, called Wheeler one of the last great innovators and mavericks of the British motor industry. Over the next 10 years the man was going to prove it, and then, without ever meaning to, disprove himself. Chapter 3. An order every 8 minutes. In October 1990, TVR took a concept car to the motor show at the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham and touched something in the British public that nobody had thought to predict. The car was called the Griffith. It was low and impossibly clean. No bumpers to speak of, no clutter, no straight lines anywhere on it. A shape that looked as though it had been poured rather than pressed. Beside it sat a second, wilder concept, a preview of the engine work to come. And the reaction on that show stand was the sort of thing that gets exaggerated in the telling, and yet, in this case, barely needs it. The deposits came in faster than the staff could write them down. The company's own legend holds that orders were arriving at a rate of 1 every 8 minutes across the run of the show. The figures handed down since put the Griffith tally somewhere north of 300 cars, with a separate rush of interest for the engine concept alongside it. Some of that has surely been burnished by 30 years of retelling. An order every 8 minutes is folklore, not an audited ledger. But strip the romance out entirely, and the hard fact still stands, and the hard fact is remarkable. A firm from a Blackpool seaside estate had walked into the biggest motor show in the country and outsold companies 1,000 times its size on the strength of a car that did not yet properly exist. TVR had done no real market research. It never would. It simply built what Peter Wheeler happened to like and counted the checks as they landed. The production Griffith reached its buyers in 1992, and the year after came the version that fixed the reputation in place, the Griffith 500. A 5-litre Rover V8, worked up to around 340 brake horsepower, installed in a car that weighed barely over a ton. By the standards of its day, it was savagely, almost comically fast, and it did all of it with no anti-lock brakes, no traction control and no electronic intervention of any kind, standing between the driver's right foot and the tarmac. If the back stepped out, it was your problem, and yours alone, to sort out. Alongside it, in 1992, came the car the dog had helped shape, the Cerbera. Softer than the Griffith, longer in the leg, a proper cross-country grand tourer where the Griffith was a scalpel. It was the more forgiving of the two, the one you could actually live with, and it became the bestseller TVR had ever built, something over 5,000 of them leaving Blackpool across its life, with some accounts putting the number higher still. Between the two cars, the little firm suddenly had a range with genuine breadth, and the order book simply refused to close. To meet the demand, TVR did the thing every healthy business does. It hired. The workforce on Bristol Avenue swelled through the decade until, at the very peak of the company's fortunes in the late 1990s, it approached 1,000 people. By 1998, the factory was turning out something like 40 cars a week, and every single one of them was assembled by hand. The fiberglass bodies were laid up wet and finished by workers whose fingers knew the compound curves the way a potter's hands know clay on a wheel. There was no robot anywhere on that floor. There was no production line in the sense that Dagenham would have recognised the phrase. There were people, and there was skill, and there was an order book that seemed as though it might never run dry. It was a wonderful way to run a car company. It was also, though nobody standing on that floor could have seen it, a time bomb with a very long fuse. A firm that builds only what its owner fancies, sells them faster than it can physically make them, and does no research at all into where the wider world is heading. That firm is magnificent, right up until the precise moment the world shifts underneath its feet. And the world was, at that very moment, preparing to shift in 2 directions at once. The first of them came from Germany, and it very nearly cost TVR the thing that made it TVR. Chapter 4. AJP. In 1994, BMW bought Rover, and Peter Wheeler, sitting in his office in Blackpool, did the piece of arithmetic that every small carmaker dreads doing. The Rover V8 that powered his entire range now belonged to a direct rival, a vast German concern that owed him precisely nothing, and that could turn off his supply of engines whenever it happened to suit them. TVR's independence had always been the whole point of TVR, and now its heart was beating by the permission of Munich. Most men in that position would have gone shopping for a different engine to buy in. Wheeler decided, instead, to build his own. It was an act of near-lunatic ambition, and it's worth being clear about the scale of it. A firm of a few hundred people, on a light industrial estate in a Lancashire seaside town, was going to design and manufacture a bespoke V8 from a completely clean sheet of paper. This is the sort of undertaking that ties up entire, well-funded engineering divisions at Ferrari and Porsche for years. Wheeler brought in a gifted and famously cussed race engine designer named Al Melling, and the engine that emerged carried the initials of the three men who willed it into being: Al Melling, John Ravenscroft, and Peter Wheeler. AJP. The result, the AJP-8, became known as the Speed 8, a 75-degree V8 built around a flat-plane crankshaft, the configuration that racing engines use, which hands the engine a hard, savage, high-revving snarl, utterly unlike the lazy woofle of an ordinary road-going V8. It arrived at 4.2 litres and around 360 brake horsepower, grew to 4.5 litres and 420, and in its most extreme state of tune, a mapping they called Red Rose, reached 440. Those were specific outputs, horsepower per litre, to shame engines built by firms 100 times TVR's size, with 100 times its budget. A cottage industry on a Blackpool trading estate had built one of the most potent, naturally aspirated V8s on the planet. They dropped it first into the Cerbera. Shown as a concept in London in 1993 and reaching production in 1996, the Cerbera was a car of firsts for the company. It was the first TVR with a fixed roof, the first with rear seats, a genuine 2+2, and the first ever to run an engine that TVR had designed and built entirely itself. Wheeler, who had a real taste for the grand and the faintly macabre, named it after Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guards the gates of Hades and makes sure that none of the dead ever get back out. A car named for the guardian of the underworld, powered by an engine built in open defiance of Munich. Nobody could ever accuse the man of understatement. For the cars further down the range, the ones that had to be built to a lower price, John Ravenscroft took the same fundamental thinking and, in engineering terms, cut it in half, producing the Speed 6, a straight six that would go on to power the Tuscan, the Tamara, the T350, and, right at the very end of everything, the Sagaris. Hold on to the Speed 6. It is the sound of TVR's hard-won independence made real. And it is also, in a few years' time, the engine that will quietly, patiently bleed the company white from the inside. But not yet. Not here, in the golden years. Because the golden years, down on that factory floor, were a thing worth conjuring. This was a workplace with its own weather. A new lad coming in for his first shift would meet the smell of the place before he was properly through the door. The sharp, chemical bite of the polyester resin used to lay up the fiberglass, a smell that got into your overalls and your hair and stayed there, so that 30 years on you'd catch a trace of it somewhere and be back on Bristol Avenue in an instant. He'd hear the compressors, the whine of the grinders shaping the cured shells, and underneath everything, the periodic, building-shaking bark of a finished engine being run up on the test bed. The stories that survive are the stories of a family firm running flat out and enjoying every minute of it. Pizzas warmed through in the paint-curing ovens when the canteen had shut for the night. The occasional cheerful, unrepeatable message left by a fitter beneath a carpet where no customer would ever find it, written for the benefit of the one man who might, years later, pull the trim apart and grin. Those were the fingerprints of people who understood they were making something that mattered. And what they were making, more and more, was quite simply the fastest legal way in Britain to get yourself killed. Which brings us, at last, to the heart of the whole matter. Chapter 5. No airbags, no apologies. Here is the thing the reputation gets completely wrong. Peter Wheeler did not refuse to think about safety. He thought about it harder and longer than almost anyone else in the business. He simply worked his way through to conclusions that the modern world had already decided were heresy. And then, being Wheeler, he refused to pretend otherwise for the sake of a quiet life. In an interview in the spring of 2004, he laid the whole thing out about as plainly as he ever would. Take anti-lock brakes. Wheeler argued that the true purpose of ABS was to allow a driver to steer while braking hard in the wet, and that a driver who actually knew what he was doing would stop a car without ABS in a shorter distance than one with it. Most modern cars, he went on, were deliberately set up to understeer in any case, to plough safely, dully, straight on when pushed too hard. And he had not the slightest interest in building a car like that. He was building cars for people who wanted to drive. Then take the airbag. And this is where the argument turned from engineering to something closer to conscience. In an open-topped car, Wheeler contended, a deploying airbag does something genuinely perverse. It fires the driver's head upward, launching it into the danger zone rather than cushioning it away from harm. And then he arrived at the moral core of the entire philosophy, the single sentence that explains the man better than any spec sheet. If someone crashed one of his cars through their own mistake, he said, then he could live with himself. But if he were to fit an airbag, and that airbag then killed someone, he could not live with that at all. That is not the voice of arrogance. That is the voice of conscience, arrived at from an unusual direction and stated without apology. His engineering case rested, in the end, on the fiberglass itself. A curved panel, he insisted, is inherently stronger than a flat one, which was precisely why, he liked to point out, a TVR had no flat panels anywhere on its body. Beneath that glorious skin sat a tubular steel backbone chassis and a windscreen surround, engineered to hold its shape in a rollover, to keep the space around the occupants intact when the car was upside down. The Tuscan, he was fond of noting, passed its offset crash test, and passed it not once, but twice. The cars wore no external door handles at all. You let yourself in with a hidden button tucked away under the wing mirror, a detail that delighted owners and baffled car park attendants in equal measure. The roof panel lifted clean out and stowed in the boot. The controls migrated onto the steering wheel, and the throttle was given a travel of something like 8 full inches, deliberately, absurdly long, so that a nervous or clumsy foot could not snap the tail loose by accident. Every one of those decisions was reasoned, everyone had a logic behind it, and every one of them, laid end to end down the length of the car, added up to the same startling total, a 200-mile-an-hour machine with no electronic safety net of any kind, arriving in showrooms at the precise moment the rest of the world's motor industry had decided to build nothing else. Honesty demands the counter-case be heard, because it is every bit as real. TVR's cars had no crumple zones in the way the modern world had come to understand the term. The firm's tiny production volumes bought it exemption from the full battery of crash testing that the mass makers had to endure. And the plain, uncomfortable truth, as more than one clear-eyed observer has since pointed out, is that a company the size of TVR could never have afforded to develop full active safety systems, even if Wheeler had woken up one morning wanting to. His principle and his budget happened to point in exactly the same direction, which is a very convenient thing for a principal to do, and it would be dishonest not to say so. And so the reputation grew and hardened and became the thing everyone knew about TVR, whether they had ever seen one or not. On television, Jeremy Clarkson lowered himself into TVR after TVR, wearing a look of pure delighted terror, and the word he kept reaching for stuck to the mark like tar: widowmaker. To a nation watching from the sofa on a Sunday evening, a TVR became instant shorthand for a car that would, given half a chance, kill you. The owners, curiously, came away telling a rather different story, of cars that had fired them off into a hedge and let them climb out and walk home, of accidents comfortably survived that a flimsier structure might not have allowed. Wheeler, it turned out, had thought about every part of this more carefully than his loudest critics ever gave him credit for. Later research into what psychologists came to call risk compensation, the well-documented way that safety features can quietly make us drive worse, would even lend his stubborn instincts a real measure of scientific support. But being right about human nature is not the same thing as being on the right side of the law. And the law, slow and patient and utterly indifferent to a man's principles, was coming. Chapter 6. Too Fast to Live. To understand exactly where TVR stood at its summit, you have to understand the one car it looked at, built, and then decided not to sell. In 1996, Wheeler took an idea to the British Motor Show that was insane even by the generous standards of the place. It was called Project 712, and in time it became the Speed 12, a 7.7-litre V12, created in essence by marrying two Speed 6 engines onto a single common crankshaft, and conceived quite seriously as a road-legal rival to the McLaren F1, then the fastest car in the world. TVR meant to race the thing at Le Mans and sell a version of it to the road. The numbers attached to it were the stuff of fever dreams and pub arguments. When they finally strapped the engine to a dynamometer to measure what it made, the engine broke the dyno, a machine rated to read all the way up to 1,000 brake horsepower. Then, two things happened in fairly short order. The rules for GT1 racing changed, and the Speed 12 was orphaned overnight as a competition car, its whole reason for existing wiped out by a stroke of a regulator's pen. And Wheeler took a road-going prototype out of the gates for himself to see what he had actually built. He did not get very far. He knew within 300 yards, he admitted afterwards, that the whole thing was a silly idea, that over 900 brake horsepower in a road car weighing barely more than a ton was, in his own flat words, plainly ridiculous. So he cancelled it. He gave the deposits back. A single road-legal example was eventually assembled and sold, years later, to a buyer Wheeler personally vetted before he'd let it go. Consider carefully what that actually means. The man the tabloids and the television would happily paint as reckless, as a builder of machines designed somehow to kill their owners, took his own ultimate creation out onto a public road, drove it for a few hundred yards, and decided that it was simply too dangerous to be allowed to exist. The philosophy that had no time at all for airbags had finally found its own outer limit, and it was Wheeler himself, nobody else, who stood at that limit and said no. That was TVR at the absolute height of its powers, confident enough to build the most extreme car in Britain, and secure enough in itself to walk calmly away from it. And it was at almost exactly this moment that the shape of a TVR travelled further than it ever had, or ever would again. In 2001, a Hollywood thriller called Swordfish put a chameleon-painted TVR Tuscan up on cinema screens across the entire planet. John Travolta's villain behind the wheel, a machine gun stowed casually in the boot. The film took well over $140 million, and audiences from Tokyo to Toronto sat watching a hand-built Blackpool sports car most of them had never heard of, and could not have named if you'd offered them money. It was the furthest a TVR's shape would ever travel from Bristol Avenue, and back on Bristol Avenue itself, the range had never been broader or the mood more buoyant. The Griffith, the Chimera, the Cerbera, the new Tuscan, with the little Tamora and the razor-edged Sagaris still to come. Close to 1,000 people came through the gates each morning. 40 finished cars left them each week. The order book was full, the engines were the firm's own, and the man who'd built all of it out of North Sea oil money and pure instinct stood at the top of everything. A chemical engineer who had made a genuine national icon, by eye, by ear, and by dog bite, and by cheerfully refusing every single thing the modern world insisted a motorcar simply had to have. He was, at that precise moment, the last of his kind, the owner of Britain's last great independent sports car maker, building cars so pure, so undiluted, that they could barely be sold anywhere the rules were written down and enforced. That was the summit, and standing there upon it, flushed with the view, nobody inside those walls could yet make out the two shapes moving steadily toward them through the fog. An engine, their own beloved engine, that was about to start quietly eating the profits from the inside, and a slow, patient, rising tide of law that was, in the end, going to make everything they did and everything they believed simply illegal. Chapter 7. The engine that ate the profits. The trouble began, as trouble in these stories so often does, with the very thing that had been the proudest achievement of them all. The Speed 6 was TVR's declaration of independence made metal. Its own engine, in its own cars, built by its own hands on its own floor, free at last of any debt to Munich or Dagenham or anyone else. It was the thing the whole company had been reaching toward for years. But it had been designed and pushed into production by a small firm working at speed, without the years of grinding validation testing that a Toyota or a Ford would run before a single customer engine ever turned a wheel in anger. The big makers test to destruction, over and over, in ways that are invisible to the buyer and ruinously expensive to fund. TVR did not have that money, and did not spend that time. And out in the world, in the hands of owners doing precisely what TVR owners had always done, the engine began to fail. The failures gathered around a phrase that passed into grim legend among the faithful. The finger followers. These were small components in the valve train, and on the early Speed 6, they wore out. Not eventually. Not at the end of a long life. Early. Camshafts wore. Valve guides wore. On the owners' forums, and TVR owners were and are among the most devoted and technically literate enthusiasts in all of motoring, the same weary story circulated in 100 versions. An engine wanting a rebuild at 35,000 miles. Sometimes a good deal less than that. Owners comparing notes the way patients in a waiting room compare symptoms, half in fellowship and half in dread. Picture the scene at the factory itself, because this is where the abstraction becomes real. By the accounts that went round among owners, there were times when dozens of Speed 6 engines sat stacked at Bristol Avenue at once, waiting their turn to be taken apart and put right. Engines that had already been built, already been paid for, already left the gates in a finished car, now back home, filling the workshop, tying up the very craftsmen who should have been building the next lot. An out-of-warranty rebuild could run an owner £3,000 and more. For the ones still under warranty, that £3,000 came out of TVR's own pocket, and it came out again and again and again. Improvements did eventually arrive, around 2003. The later engines were genuinely better, the worst of the wear designed out. But an engine's reputation, once made, is very hard to unmake, and the money already spent does not come back. The reputational damage was done. The financial damage was done, and the financial kind is the kind that closes factories. Consider the particular cruelty of it. The engine that stood for everything TVR had fought to become, its freedom, its self-reliance, its refusal to buy in what it could make itself, was now the engine quietly draining the firm's money away, one warranty claim, one stacked cylinder head, one apologetic phone call at a time. Every rebuilt Speed 6 on a bench in Blackpool was a car that had already been sold once, being paid for a second time by the company that made it. Purity, it turned out, carried a bill. And it was a bill that a firm building 40 cars a week, with no deep-pocketed parent standing behind it, had no realistic way of settling forever. That was the enemy within, working away in the dark. The enemy without was slower and quieter, and in the end, a great deal more final. For years, TVR's tininess had been a kind of shield. Low-volume manufacturers across Europe enjoyed a set of exemptions. Relief from the full crushing weight of crash testing. Relief from great swathes of the type approval machinery that governed the companies making cars by the million. It was inside the shelter of those exemptions that a car with no airbag and no anti-lock brakes could still, perfectly legally, be built and sold. That shelter was the ground TVR stood on, and the ground was shrinking. The direction of European law only ever moved one way. Type approval requirements tightened, emissions standards tightened, each new tier demanding cleaner running, more control, more electronics, more of everything a wheeler car was built to do without. The space in which a company could still make a light, loud, analog, undefended machine and put it on sale grew narrower with every passing year, and anyone paying attention could see the walls drawing in. A car conceived entirely around the principle of leaving things out was being asked, by law, to put more and more of them back. And then there was America, the largest sports car market on the face of the earth, the prize that every maker of fast two-seaters dreams, at some point, of taking. The market that could have turned TVR from a magnificent cottage industry into something that might actually survive at scale. And TVR could never touch it. Federal safety law in the United States mandated airbags, plainly and without appeal. A TVR, by the deepest and most immovable principle of the man who owned it, did not have one and never would. The two facts simply could not be made to meet. And so the door to the world's biggest market stayed shut, bolted in the end, from the inside, by Peter Wheeler's own conscience, and the company's ambitions stayed capped at a size that left it permanently and dangerously small. A firm bleeding money on its own beloved engine, a tide of law steadily criminalizing its founding beliefs, a vast market locked away behind a principle its owner would not, could not, abandon. Take any one of these away and TVR might have carried on for years. Together, they closed around the company like a hand, and a company held in a hand like that has sooner or later to make a decision about whether it has a future at all. Peter Wheeler was in his early 60s now. He had been at it for more than 20 years. He was, by more than one account, simply tired of the regulation, of the fight, of the endless grind of keeping a hand-built car firm breathing in a world built for giants. The great engine of his own contrariness was running low, and so he came at last to the decision that every founder in every one of these stories arrives at in the end. He decided to sell. Chapter 8. The Sale. On the 27th of July 2004, Peter Wheeler sold TVR. The price was somewhere around £15 million, and the man he sold it to was 24 years old. His name was Nikolai Smolensky. He had been born on the 11th of June 1980, a date that would, by a coincidence too strange for fiction, one day mark the anniversary of Wheeler's own death. He was the son of Alexander Smolensky, a Russian banker who had founded a bank called SBS Agro, and that bank had gone down in the Russian financial crisis of 1998, owing, by the reckonings of the time, well over $1 billion. The son had been educated partly in Britain and partly in Austria, and by the time he arrived in Blackpool he was, according to the profiles that ran then, extraordinarily wealthy in his own right, reported to have taken over a Russian bank and sold it on within a year for a very large sum, and named by one finance magazine as Russia's youngest ruble billionaire, with a personal fortune put somewhere in the region of £55 million. It's important to be fair to the young man here, because hindsight is a machine for turning the merely overwhelmed into villains, and that is not quite what happened, or not only that. On paper at the time, the deal did not look like madness. Smolensky was cash rich, and cash was the one thing a firm strangled for investment desperately needed. He presented himself as a true enthusiast, declaring that he had always been a fan of British car manufacturing and believed the best automotive designers and engineers in the world were to be found in this country. And he promised the workforce the very things a worried workforce most longs to hear: investment, modernization, expansion into new markets, a real future for the mark that would keep it British and keep it building. A weary founder ready to let go, an eager young buyer with money in his pocket and warmth in his voice. It is not hard, standing in that moment, to see exactly why the deal got done, and to see it done with a measure of genuine hope on all sides. The first car of the new era was already coming down the line, and what a car it was. The Sagaris, unveiled in 2005, was by common consent one of the most beautiful and most vicious things TVR ever built. 4 litres of speed. 6, over 400 brake horsepower, a body carved all over with slashes and vents and gills, and a great transparent rear spoiler standing proud of the tail. 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds, and on toward 185 miles an hour. It was the whole philosophy taken to its logical, glorious, unrepentant extreme. The purest expression of everything Wheeler had ever believed, arriving just as the man himself walked out of the door. It was also, though nobody wished to say it aloud, the last new model line the company would ever properly bring to market. And beneath the beautiful new car, in the parts nobody photographs, the warning signs were already there for anyone willing to read a ledger. There is a story, told among people who were there in those months, of Sagaris being fitted with cheap stereos bought over the counter from a shop in Blackpool, because the proper suppliers had stopped delivering, and the proper suppliers had stopped delivering because they had stopped being paid. Whether every last detail of that tale is exact hardly matters. The shape of it is true, and the shape of it is the shape of a company running out of money in real time, improvising, patching, hoping the next check comes before the next demand. By the figures that have come down since, and these deserve to be treated with real caution, drawn as they are from secondary accounts, rather than from filed and audited books, the losses in 2004 reached something like £11.5 million. Output had fallen well below the level the firm needed simply to break even. The number of cars it had to build each year to cover its own costs, and the number it was actually building, had opened up a gap that no enthusiasm could close. Weekly production, once running steadily at 12 cars, was reported to have slid toward 3 or 4. So here is the situation at the summit of the new era, laid out plainly. The saviour of TVR had, after 23 years, handed the entire mark to a 24-year-old, and the warning signs were already written, in ink, in the ledgers of unpaid suppliers, and in the widening gulf between what TVR spent and what it earned. In February 2006, the company would spend £120,000 on a stand at the London Motor Show. A grand gesture, an act of theatre, a public statement that all was well, while behind the scenery, the ground was already opening. That same spring, By the trade press accounts of the time, the first tranche of workers was laid off, and the ones left behind were told, in plain words, that they had no guaranteed future. The last great independent sports car maker in Britain had, at that point, roughly 8 months left as a place that made cars. Chapter 9. Sent home before Christmas. What happened to TVR in 2006 did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one landing heavier than the one before, across a single, long and terrible year. And to tell it honestly, you have to slow right down, because the people who lived through it have never once, in all the years since, been able to speed it up in the telling. In the spring, the threat put on a number. In April, around 260 jobs, which was very nearly everyone, were reported to be under threat. The whole workforce, the whole of Bristol Avenue, hanging in the balance at once. There were talks with the union. There was a reprieve of a kind, an indication from the company that it meant to stay in Lancashire, to move to a new site, to keep the thing alive somehow. Hope was extended across the table, and the workers took it, because when hope is the only thing on offer, you take it, and you go home, and you tell your family that it might yet be all right. Then came the 18th of October 2006. On that day, Smolensky announced that body production and final assembly would be moved to Turin, in Italy. Engine work, he said, would remain in the United Kingdom, and around 250 jobs would go at Blackpool. The heart of the operation, the laying up of the fiberglass, the building of the cars, the skilled handwork that was the entire point of a TVR, would leave the town that had done it for the better part of 40 years. Dave McCall, the union's regional secretary for the North West, found the words that most people were feeling. It was, he said, a bitter blow for Blackpool and for an iconic British sports car. Smolensky's own statement wore the language of sorrow. He was extremely sorry, he said, that after a period of uncertainty and raised hopes that production might continue in Blackpool, this decision had had to be taken. He said he was acutely aware of the shock and the distress it would cause the staff and their families. And now the staff and their families waited, through the back end of that autumn, to find out what the words were actually worth. They were not left waiting long. On the 10th of November, TVR sent 158 of its 250 Blackpool workers home. Andy Robertson, the union's industrial organiser, put it into a single sentence that has never needed any help from anyone since. The personal undertakings that the owner had given to the union, he said, had been effectively ripped up. 158 men and women, sent home, skilled people, fiberglass finishers, engine builders, fitters, sprayers, trimmers, some of whom had given the best part of their entire working lives to that factory on Bristol Avenue, people who had built 200-mile-an-hour cars with their own hands, told to go home and wait. The people who understood best what was being lost were not, at first, in the government or the press. They were the owners, the men and women who drove the cars these workers had built, who knew exactly whose hands had laid up the panel and torqued the head, understood what was happening, even as the wider country carried on unaware. And on the 26th of November, they did the only thing they could think to do. They drove. They took their TVRs, Griffiths and Chimeras and Cerberas and Tuscans, the loudest road cars in Britain, and they ran them in a convoy through the centre of London, in support of the workers who had made them. They called it London Thunder. For one afternoon, the streets of the capital shook and roared with the sound of the very engines now standing cold and silent, up in Blackpool, driven by the people who loved them, on behalf of the people who had built them. It was a magnificent, useless, heartbreaking gesture, the kind of thing that changes nothing and matters enormously. And then came December. December is where this story stops being a tragedy and turns into something colder and more deliberate. In the middle of the month, the company was broken into pieces. Where there had been one firm, there were suddenly three. TVR Motors would hold the brand, the intellectual property, the right to sell cars under the name. TVR Power would take on parts and spares, carried out through a management buyout. And Blackpool Automotive, and this is the one to watch, would hold the factory itself, the manufacturing assets, and the workers. Look at what that structure does before you're told what happened next. It puts the valuable things, the name, the reputation, the profitable spares business, into their own protected vessels, and it puts the factory, the machinery, and the people into a separate one. Days later, the directors moved. Smolensky and the production director, Mike Penny, resigned as directors of Blackpool Automotive. In their place came two new names: Smolensky's own personal assistant, a man called Roger Billinghurst, and a 25-year-old with a Vienna address by the name of Angelko Stamenkov. Read that sequence through once more, slowly, because the whole of it turns on the order of events. The company is split. The brand and the spares are carried to safety in their separate vessels, and the part that holds the factory and the 250 people is left in the hands of a personal assistant and a 25-year-old just before Christmas. Then, in the last days before Christmas 2006, a receivership announced around the 22nd, the firm in administration by around the 24th, Blackpool Automotive, went under. Production had, in truth, effectively stopped back in September. Perhaps 20 cars sat unfinished on the silent floor as the paperwork moved around them. And the workers, somewhere between 245 and 250 of them, were left with no pay and no redundancy compensation of any kind. 3 days, give or take, before Christmas. That is the single hardest fact in the whole of this story. It deserves to be set down with no decoration whatsoever, because it needs none. Craftsmen who had built supercars with their own hands were sent into Christmas with nothing. The union did not go quietly, and the record should not let them. Dave McCall and Andy Robertson fought it at every turn, and afterwards McCall called openly for a government inquiry into the entire affair, the sacking of over 250 skilled workers with no pay, and the hokey-cokey, as he called it, of people laid off and then taken back on and then laid off again. Corporate legislation, he said, was not working for working people and their families. The union laboured alongside the local members of Parliament, Blackpool Council and the Regional Development Agency, all of them trying to find some route, any route, to keep the making of motorcars in the town where motorcars had been made for 60 years. They could not find one. The decisions that mattered had already been taken, in rooms the workers were never allowed into, by people whose names most of them would never even learn. What does a town owe the people who built its proudest export, and what is owed to them when it ends? Blackpool never got to answer that. The question was closed before it could be properly asked. Chapter 10. The Wheeler Hub. What came afterward has the quality of a long, fading echo, a series of announcements, each one a little fainter than the last, and not one of them ever quite managing to become true. In February 2007, Smolensky bought the company back out of administration, the highest bidder for the wreckage of the very thing he had owned all along. The union's fury at that scarcely needs describing. The man who had presided over the collapse now stood as the buyer of its remains. Within days there was talk of onward sale to other buyers. Through that year and into the next, there were fresh promises, each delivered with apparent conviction, that production would restart, that there would be 2,000 cars a year, that a Sagaris 2 would rise somewhere near Wesham, and the mark would live again on Lancashire soil. None of it happened. Not one of those cars was ever built. The announcements simply grew quieter and further apart, and then they stopped altogether. Bristol Avenue, occupied since 1970, fell silent for good. And a silence, in a place that was built for that much noise, is not the same thing as an ordinary silence. A factory that has run for decades carries a presence even when the machines are switched off. The hum of the ventilation, the movement of bodies, the low permanent thrum of a working world going about itself. When the whole of that stops, the first thing you notice is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of a silence that is somehow the wrong shape for the building it has settled into. A quiet that doesn't fit. Peter Wheeler did not live to see much of the aftermath, and it is tempting to think that was a mercy. He had been ill for some time, cancer, and he died on the 11th of June 2009 at the age of 65. The chemical engineer who had bought a bankrupt little car firm with his North Sea oil money and turned it, by sheer force of instinct and opinion and cigarette smoke, into a national legend, was gone. Trevor Wilkinson, the man who had started the whole thing in a wheelwright's shed with the running gear of a Dodgem, had died the year before, in 2008 at the age of 85. The founder and the saviour gone within a year of one another, the company they had each in turn given their lives to already a ghost by the time they went. The buildings on Bristol Avenue came down in stages across the following decade, the last remnants cleared away in the 2020s. The land itself stayed with the trust that Wheeler had left behind, and in the place where the factory had stood, there rose a development of commercial units, and here the name arrives like a quiet hand laid on the shoulder. Called the Wheeler Hub, there are plans on the very ground where the cars were once built by hand for a life-size bronze statue of Peter Wheeler, with Ned the pointer at his side. The dog who bit the styling model of the Cerbera and left his teeth marks in a car that sold in its thousands, cast now in bronze, forever, on the spot where the studio used to be. The mark itself did not quite die. In June 2013, Smolensky sold TVR onto a British consortium, TVR Automotive, led by a businessman called Les Edgar. And this time, for a while, there was real substance behind the hope. Between 2015 and 2017, a genuinely new Griffith was developed, using the ingenious I-stream carbon composite architecture devised by Gordon Murray, the celebrated designer of that very same McLaren F1. The old Speed 12 had once been dreamed up to chase, powered by a Cosworth-fettled Ford V8. It was unveiled at the Goodwood Revival in 2017 to a genuine swell of excitement. A factory was planned at Ebbw Vale in the South Wales Valleys, backed by Welsh government money and the promise of around 150 jobs in a place that badly needed them. And then, once more, it stalled. The government's own stake in the venture tripped over European state aid rules, which forced an EU-wide tender for the very construction of the plant, which in turn delayed everything that was supposed to follow. The car slipped. Then it slipped again. Years went by. The new Griffith, for all its brilliance, for all its backing, for all the goodwill in the world behind it, did not enter series production. The name had outlived the factory, and the man, and the workforce. It simply had not managed, in all those years, to build another car. Chapter 11. What remains? So what, in the end, is the dark story of TVR? It was never the thing the poster promised. Peter Wheeler was not an arrogant man building machines designed to kill the people who drove them. That is a marketing hook, and it is very nearly the exact opposite of the truth. He was a man who thought about safety more carefully, not less, than the critics who mocked him, who reasoned his way to unfashionable conclusions and then had the courage, or the sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, and at that altitude, the two are the same thing, to stand behind them when it would have been so much easier not to. He drew a line his own conscience would not let him step across, and when his own ultimate creation stepped across it, he was the one who cancelled the car. The real tragedy of the man is not that he was reckless, it is that he was sincere, and sincerity turned out to be no defence at all against the world that was coming for him, because the world did change underneath him, exactly as it had always quietly threatened to. The law tightened year upon patient year until a car that was light and loud and undefended could no longer legally be sold. The one market big enough to save him stayed locked behind a principle he would not surrender to reach it. The engine that had symbolized his hard-won independence drained his accounts from the inside, one rebuild at a time. And when the tired founder finally handed the whole of it to a young man with money and warm words, the Marquet he had spent 23 years building was taken apart inside 2 years, split into pieces, the valuable parts carried carefully to safety, the factory and the people left holding nothing at all, 3 days before Christmas. Britain's last great independent sports car maker built cars so pure that they could not survive the modern age. That is the whole of it, really. Not a villain's crime. A craftsman's stubbornness, running headlong into a bill that no small maker on earth could ever have paid. Stand on Bristol Avenue today, among the neat commercial units of the Wheeler Hub, and there is nothing left to hear. The compressors are gone. The grinders that shaped the cured shells are gone. The building-shaking bark of a Speed 6 run-up on the test bed is gone, and the men and women whose hands knew the compound curve of a fiberglass panel the way a potter's hands know clay on a wheel have long since found other work, or found no work, or simply grown old with the town. But somewhere, out on a wet road on a Sunday morning, a Griffith fires up. No airbag, no anti-lock brakes, no electronic net of any kind strung between its driver and the tarmac, and it makes the only sound that ever really mattered here. Loud, proud, British-built, and trusting the person behind the wheel completely, absolutely, without reservation, in a way that nothing built since is ever again allowed to trust us. That was TVR. It asked everything of the people who drove it, and it forgave them nothing. and a certain kind of person loved it beyond all reason for precisely that. When it was gone, the silence it left behind was the wrong shape, and it has stayed the wrong shape ever since.